Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we are going to a period of Egyptian history that most people have simply never encountered. A story that unfolds not between Egypt and some external enemy like the Hittites at Kadesh or the mysterious sea peoples in the Delta, but within Egypt itself, between Egyptians and the foreign rulers who had settled among them, and eventually between Egyptians and each other, in a prolonged struggle that would ultimately determine whether Egypt would remain a fragmented, divided land or would be forged back into the unified, powerful empire that would go on to produce Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, and eventually Ramesses II himself. And before we begin, let me tell you 3 things that will stay with you through this entire story. First, for roughly a century before this story begins, Egypt was not actually ruled by Egyptians. A foreign people known as the Hyksos, whose precise origins remain debated among historians to this day, had established their own kingdom in the eastern Nile Delta, ruling as pharaohs in their own right, adopting Egyptian royal titles and Egyptian religious customs, while native Egyptian rulers were pushed southward, reduced to governing only a portion of Upper Egypt from the city of Thebes, forced to accept a genuinely humiliating position as something close to vassals paying tribute to foreign kings who occupied the traditional heartland of pharaonic power. This period, which modern historians call the Second Intermediate Period, represented one of the most genuinely traumatic episodes in the entire span of ancient Egyptian history, a wound to Egyptian pride and Egyptian self-understanding that would shape the strategic thinking of Egyptian rulers for centuries afterward. Second, the War of Liberation that eventually expelled the Hyksos and reunified Egypt was not won in a single dramatic battle or by a single heroic king. It took 3 successive generations of the same royal family, a war stretching across decades, and it began with a mummy. The preserved body of the pharaoh Seqenenre Tao, one of the earliest kings to take up arms against Hyksos domination, survives today in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and it displays some of the most horrific battle wounds ever discovered on any ancient royal mummy. Wounds so severe and so specific that modern forensic examination has allowed scholars to reconstruct, with genuinely disturbing precision, exactly how this king died and exactly what kind of violence Egypt's internal conflict actually involved. Third, this was not simply a war between Egyptians and foreign Hyksos occupiers. It was, in its final and most dramatic phase, also genuinely a civil war between different factions of Egyptians themselves, since a significant Nubian kingdom to the south, sometimes allied with the Hyksos against the Theban Egyptian rulers, meant that the War of Liberation was fought simultaneously on 2 fronts, north against the Hyksos and south against Nubian forces, by kings who could trust neither their northern nor their southern neighbors, and who had to rebuild Egyptian military capacity essentially from scratch while surrounded by enemies on every side. So go ahead and get comfortable. Lights down. Blanket up. This one is slow and calm and going nowhere fast. And if you haven't subscribed yet, we're here every night, new story. Same pace. Lights always low. Let's begin. To understand how Egypt came to fight this remarkable internal war for its own reunification and independence, we need to travel back to a period considerably earlier than any of the conflicts we have examined in our previous explorations of Egyptian military history. We need to understand the collapse of the Middle Kingdom, the earlier period of strong, centralized Egyptian rule that had itself followed an earlier period of fragmentation, and the specific circumstances that allowed a foreign people to establish themselves so successfully within Egyptian territory that they could eventually claim pharaonic authority over a significant portion of the country. The Middle Kingdom period, which had followed Egypt's first intermediate period of political fragmentation, and had itself been founded through a comparable process of reunification under Theban rulers centuries before the events we are examining tonight, had represented a genuine golden age of Egyptian centralized administration, literary achievement, and military expansion, particularly southward into Nubia, where Middle Kingdom pharaohs had constructed an extensive network of fortresses along the Nile designed to control trade routes and to project Egyptian power deep into Nubian territory. These fortresses, massive mud brick structures positioned at the narrow, dangerous stretches of the Nile known as cataracts, represented a genuinely sophisticated system of frontier control, staffed by garrison troops, supplied through carefully organized logistics chains running back to the Egyptian heartland, and designed specifically to monitor and control the flow of trade goods, particularly gold, ivory, and exotic animal products, moving northward from the African interior into Egyptian territory. This period of strength, however, gradually gave way to renewed weakness during the later stages of the Middle Kingdom, weakness driven by a combination of factors that historians continue to study and debate, including apparent succession difficulties within the royal family, a series of unusually low Nile floods that may have contributed to agricultural difficulties and reduced state revenues, and a gradual erosion of centralized royal authority relative to increasingly powerful regional administrators, men who controlled specific provinces, known to the Egyptians as nomes, and who over time accumulated increasing degrees of local autonomy, their own regional militias, and their own capacity to act with diminishing reference to central royal authority. It was during this period of gradual Middle Kingdom weakening that a significant population of Western Asiatic peoples, originating from the region of Canaan and the broader Levantine coast, appears to have begun settling within the eastern Nile Delta in increasing numbers, initially likely through a combination of voluntary migration, seeking the agricultural opportunities and relative prosperity that Delta settlement offered, and possibly through more organized processes including trade, relationships, and, in some cases, forced settlement of captured populations. Archaeological evidence from Delta sites dating to this transitional period reveals the gradual accumulation of distinctly Western Asiatic material culture alongside more traditional Egyptian artifacts, suggesting a genuine process of demographic and cultural blending occurring over multiple generations rather than any single dramatic moment of foreign arrival or foreign conquest. This gradual demographic shift, occurring over an extended period likely spanning multiple generations, eventually produced a substantial population within the Eastern Delta whose cultural, linguistic, and religious traditions differed significantly from those of native Egyptian populations elsewhere in the country, while nonetheless existing within Egyptian territory and increasingly interacting with and influencing the broader administrative and political structures of this region. Egyptian texts from this transitional period occasionally reference these Western Asiatic populations using terms that suggest a degree of ongoing distinctiveness and occasional friction, alongside considerable evidence of economic integration, intermarriage, and the gradual adoption of Egyptian administrative titles and Egyptian religious practices by at least some portion of this immigrant population. The term Hyksos itself, which modern historians use to refer to the eventual foreign dynasty that would emerge from this population and claim pharaonic authority, derives from an Egyptian phrase that translates roughly as rulers of foreign lands, a designation that itself reveals something of how Egyptian tradition understood and categorized these foreign rulers as legitimate holders of political power, but ones whose fundamental origin and identity remained explicitly marked as foreign, distinct from the native Egyptian understanding of proper pharaonic legitimacy that had traditionally been understood to flow through specifically Egyptian royal lineages stretching back to the earliest periods of pharaonic history. Later Egyptian historical tradition, including an account preserved by the Egyptian priest Manetho writing many centuries afterward during the Ptolemaic period, describes this Hyksos rise to power in genuinely dramatic terms, characterizing it as a sudden and violent invasion by foreign peoples who overran the country and burned its cities, a characterization that modern historians treat with considerable caution, since the archaeological evidence more strongly supports a gradual process of demographic settlement and eventual political consolidation rather than any single, sudden military conquest of the kind Manetho's much later account describes. The specific process by which this Western Asiatic population within the Delta eventually transitioned from simply residing within a weakening Egyptian kingdom to actually claiming independent pharaonic authority over this territory remains somewhat obscured by the limited and fragmentary nature of surviving historical sources from this particular period, sources that are considerably less extensive and considerably less well preserved than the rich documentary and archaeological record we have been able to draw upon regarding later periods, including the New Kingdom conflicts we examined in our previous explorations of Kadesh and the Sea People's invasion. What does seem reasonably clear from the available evidence is that by sometime in the 17th century BCE, a Hyksos dynasty had established itself as the ruling power over the eastern Delta region, with its capital at the city of Avaris, and had extended its authority, whether through direct military conquest, negotiated political arrangement, or some combination of both, over Memphis and much of northern and central Egypt as well. This left native Egyptian royal authority confined to a considerably reduced territory in the south, centered on the city of Thebes, the same city whose later importance and eventual destruction by Assyrian forces we examined in our previous exploration of the later Assyrian and Persian conquests of Egypt. The Theban rulers of this period, whom modern historians classify as constituting Egypt's 17th dynasty, existed in what was, by most available evidence, a position of genuine subordination to Hyksos authority, likely paying tribute and acknowledging, at least formally, some degree of Hyksos political supremacy, even while maintaining their own local royal titles and their own distinct administrative structures within their reduced southern territory. This reduced Theban kingdom, stretching along the Nile for a considerable distance south of the actual city of Thebes but representing only a fraction of the total territorial extent that a fully unified Egyptian kingdom would traditionally have controlled, became the base from which the eventual war of liberation we are examining tonight would ultimately be launched. Life under divided rule. Let's spend some time now understanding what daily life and political reality actually looked like for ordinary Egyptians living through this genuinely unusual period of divided sovereignty, because understanding this lived reality helps us appreciate both why the eventual war of liberation carried such profound significance for Egyptian identity and self-understanding, and why it took so many years and so many successive rulers to actually accomplish. The Hyksos rulers of the north, whatever the precise circumstances of their original rise to power, appear to have governed their territory in a manner that incorporated substantial elements of traditional Egyptian administrative and religious practice, a pattern we have observed repeatedly throughout our examinations of foreign rule over Egypt in various periods, including the later Kushite, Assyrian, and Persian episodes we explored previously. Hyksos rulers adopted traditional Egyptian royal titulature, presented themselves using traditional pharaonic iconography and religious symbolism, and appear to have maintained continued patronage of at least some traditional Egyptian religious institutions, even while apparently introducing or emphasizing worship of certain deities, particularly the god Set, whom they appear to have particularly favored possibly due to some perceived similarity or connection between Set and deities from their own Western Asiatic religious traditions, including possibly the storm god Baal, whose warlike and turbulent characteristics bore some genuine resemblance to Set's own established position within the traditional Egyptian pantheon as a god of storms, chaos, and the harsh, untamed desert regions beyond the cultivated Nile Valley. This pattern of substantial cultural and administrative accommodation to Egyptian tradition, while consistent with the broader pattern we have observed regarding other periods of foreign rule over Egypt, should not obscure the genuine significance of what this period represented from the perspective of native Egyptian political and cultural identity. The fundamental principle of Egyptian pharaonic legitimacy, as it had developed over many preceding centuries, rested significantly on concepts of proper descent, proper religious devotion specifically directed toward maintaining Ma'at, the fundamental cosmic and social order that Egyptian religious and political ideology held the legitimate pharaoh personally responsible for upholding, and a broader ideological framework that understood proper Egyptian kingship as intimately connected to specifically Egyptian identity and specifically Egyptian religious and cultural tradition in ways that a foreign ruling dynasty, however successfully it might adopt Egyptian administrative practices and religious symbolism, could never entirely satisfy from the perspective of native Egyptian political and religious ideology. The daily texture of life within Hyksos-controlled northern Egypt during this period would have included many continuities alongside these significant political changes. The ordinary farmer working the fields along the Nile would have continued to plant and harvest according to the same agricultural calendar dictated by the annual flood that had governed Egyptian agricultural life for many centuries, regardless of whether taxes on that harvest ultimately flowed to a Hyksos administrator in Avaris or, in earlier generations, to a native Egyptian official answering to Memphis or Thebes. The traditional Egyptian household religious practices we have discussed extensively in our earlier explorations of Egyptian daily life, including the household worship of protective deities like Bes and Tauret, appear to have continued largely undisturbed throughout this period, since the Hyksos administration showed little apparent interest in suppressing or fundamentally altering the religious practices of the broader Egyptian population under their control, focusing their own particular religious emphasis primarily on royal and state-level religious patronage, rather than attempting any comprehensive transformation of popular religious practice throughout the territory they controlled. The Theban rulers of the 17th dynasty, governing their reduced southern territory under conditions of apparent subordination to Hyksos authority, would have experienced this situation not merely as an unfortunate but ultimately manageable political circumstance, but as a genuine and ongoing affront to the proper cosmic and political order that Egyptian religious and political ideology understood proper pharaonic rule to represent and maintain. This ideological dimension helps explain why the eventual War of Liberation, when it finally began in earnest, appears to have been understood and represented, at least within the surviving Egyptian sources produced by the eventually victorious Theban dynasty, not simply as an ordinary political or territorial conflict, but as a matter of genuine cosmic and religious significance, a struggle to restore proper order against what Egyptian ideology understood as an illegitimate and disordering foreign presence within the sacred land of Egypt itself. The specific economic and administrative relationship between the Theban South and the Hyksos North during this period of divided rule remains somewhat unclear from the available evidence, though surviving references suggest ongoing trade relationships and at least periodic diplomatic communication between the two courts, alongside the underlying tension and eventual conflict that would characterize the relationship's final, decisive phase. The Nile itself, as the primary transportation artery connecting the entire length of the Egyptian territory from the southern frontier all the way to the Mediterranean coast, would have continued to carry trade goods and travelers between these two politically separated regions throughout this period, since the practical realities of Egyptian geography, with virtually the entire population and virtually all significant economic activity concentrated within the narrow strip of cultivable land, along the river's banks, made complete economic separation between the northern and southern portions of the country genuinely difficult to achieve even during periods of significant political division and periodic military hostility. Some surviving Egyptian literary sources from later periods, composed after the eventual Theban victory and reunification, describe specific diplomatic incidents and exchanges between Hyksos and Theban rulers that, whatever their precise historical accuracy, reflect Egyptian cultural memory regarding the genuine tension and eventual hostility that characterized this relationship, including one particularly famous later literary account describing a Hyksos ruler named Apipi sending an apparently deliberately provocative message to his Theban counterpart Seqenenre, complaining about the noise supposedly created by hippopotamuses in a sacred pool near Thebes disturbing his sleep in far-distant Avaris, a physically impossible claim given the actual distance of several hundred miles between the two cities, that later Egyptian audiences would have understood as a deliberately absurd provocation, illustrating the kind of political theater and psychological conflict that characterized relations between the two courts even before open military conflict began. This particular literary text, known to modern scholars as the Quarrel of Apipi and Seqenenre, survives only in fragmentary form, breaking off before revealing how Seqenenre actually responded to this provocative demand, a frustrating gap in the surviving papyrus that has left generations of Egyptologists wondering exactly how this dramatic literary confrontation was originally resolved, though the broader historical narrative we know from other sources suggests that whatever specific response Seqenenre gave, the underlying tension between the two courts was clearly moving toward the kind of open conflict that the physical evidence of Seqenenre's own mummy would eventually confirm. Seqenenre Tao and the beginning of rebellion. Let's now turn to the specific individual whose reign marks, according to most historical reconstructions, the actual beginning of active Egyptian military resistance against Hyksos domination. The Theban pharaoh Seqenenre Tao, whose preserved mummy provides us with some of the most dramatic and most disturbing physical evidence available from this entire period of Egyptian history. Seqenenre Tao ruled Thebes and its surrounding southern territory sometime in the early to mid-16th century BCE, inheriting the position of subordinate southern ruler that his 17th dynasty predecessors had occupied under conditions of Hyksos political supremacy. The specific circumstances that led Seqenenre to eventually take up active military resistance against this arrangement, rather than continuing the pattern of accommodation that appears to have generally characterized the relationship between Thebes and Avaris during the preceding period, remains somewhat unclear from the available historical sources, though the later literary tradition, including the account of the provocative hippopotamus message we mentioned in the previous section, suggests that Egyptian cultural memory understood this transition toward active conflict as connected to specific instances of perceived Hyksos provocation and insult toward Theban royal dignity and authority. What we can establish with considerably greater confidence, thanks to remarkable modern forensic examination of Seqenenre's preserved mummy, is the genuinely brutal manner of this pharaoh's eventual death, evidence that provides us with an unusually direct and unusually visceral window into the actual violence of this early phase of Egyptian internal conflict. When Seqenenre's mummy was first unwrapped by modern archaeologists in the late 19th century, examiners immediately noted the presence of multiple severe head wounds, wounds so extensive and so clearly the result of deliberate violence that questions regarding the exact circumstances of the pharaoh's death have been the subject of ongoing scholarly investigation and forensic analysis for well over a century. The initial 19th century examination, conducted with the comparatively limited forensic and medical knowledge available at that time, nonetheless immediately recognized that this particular royal mummy presented something genuinely different from the more peaceful, natural death that characterized most other preserved royal remains from this general period of Egyptian history. Where other pharaonic mummies typically showed the kind of gradual physical deterioration associated with advancing age or, in some cases, evidence of specific diseases or ailments consistent with natural death, Seqenenre's remains displayed clear evidence of catastrophic, violent trauma concentrated specifically around the head and face, trauma of a nature and severity that immediately suggested this pharaoh had died not peacefully in his own bed, but through some form of direct, violent, physical assault. Modern computed tomography scanning and detailed forensic examination, conducted in recent years using considerably more sophisticated technology than was available to the original 19th century examiners, has allowed researchers to reconstruct the specific sequence and nature of these wounds with genuinely remarkable precision. The examination reveals that Seqenenre suffered multiple distinct blows to the head and face, apparently inflicted by several different weapons, including what appears to have been an axe blow to the forehead consistent with the specific type of battle axe used by Hyksos or Hyksos allied forces during this period, along with additional wounds from what appear to have been daggers or similar bladed weapons, and evidence suggesting the pharaoh's hands may have been bound at the time these fatal wounds were inflicted, a detail that has led some researchers to suggest that Seqenenre may have been captured, perhaps on a battlefield or during some other military engagement, and subsequently executed while bound and unable to defend himself, rather than dying in the immediate heat of direct combat. The specific pattern and angle of these wounds has allowed forensic researchers to make additional inferences regarding the circumstances of this attack, including the suggestion that multiple attackers, positioned at different angles relative to the pharaoh's body, may have been involved in inflicting these fatal injuries, consistent with a scenario in which a captured or otherwise incapacitated Seqenenre was surrounded and attacked by several assailants simultaneously, rather than facing a single opponent in anything resembling a fair or symmetrical combat encounter. This detail, while genuinely disturbing to contemplate, provides us with a remarkably specific and remarkably direct window into the actual physical reality of violence during this period of Egyptian history, transforming what might otherwise remain a somewhat abstract historical narrative into something considerably more visceral and considerably more immediately affecting. Some researchers have additionally noted evidence suggesting that Seqenenre's body may have lain exposed for some period of time following his death before receiving the mummification treatment that ultimately preserved his remains for the more than 3,500 years that separate his death from our own modern examination of his preserved body. Evidence including the specific state of decomposition visible in certain tissues that suggests the embalming process may have been delayed, potentially consistent with a scenario in which the pharaoh died at some distance from the embalming facilities that would normally have received his body promptly following a death occurring under more controlled, expected circumstances, such as a natural death within the royal palace itself, where the elaborate mummification process we examined in detail during our earlier exploration of Egyptian mummification could have begun within the ideal time frame of a day or two following death. This forensic evidence, whatever its precise implications regarding the exact circumstances of Seqenenre's death, provides us with unusually direct physical confirmation that this period of Egyptian history involved genuine, serious, and genuinely brutal armed conflict, rather than simply representing an abstract political and diplomatic tension that historians might otherwise be tempted to reconstruct primarily from later, potentially embellished literary accounts. The specific violence inflicted upon Seqenenre's body, preserved and directly observable more than 3,500 years after his death, represents one of the most genuinely striking pieces of physical evidence available from this entire period of ancient Egyptian history, transforming what might otherwise remain a somewhat abstract historical narrative into a genuinely visceral, physically documented reality. Seqenenre's death, whatever its precise circumstances, did not end the conflict he had apparently initiated against Hyksos authority. Instead, according to the subsequent historical record, the mantle of continued resistance passed to his successors, beginning what would become a genuinely multi-generational family project of military resistance and eventual reunification that would ultimately require the efforts of Seqenenre's successors, Kamose and eventually Ahmose, before the war would finally reach its decisive conclusion. The specific family relationships connecting these three successive rulers remain a matter of some scholarly discussion, with most reconstructions suggesting that Kamose was either Seqenenre's son or possibly his brother, and that Ahmose was, in turn, either Kamose's younger brother or, according to some interpretations, his son, though the relatively limited surviving genealogical evidence from this period means that these specific family relationships cannot always be established with complete certainty. Kamose and the war intensifies. Let's now turn to Kamose, who succeeded Seqenenre as Theban pharaoh, likely as either his son or possibly his brother, depending on which scholarly reconstruction of the specific royal genealogy of this period one follows, and whose own reign, though apparently relatively brief, witnessed a genuinely significant escalation and intensification of the military conflict that his predecessor had apparently initiated. Our knowledge of Kamose's specific military campaigns derives primarily from a set of remarkable inscriptions, commonly referred to by modern scholars as the Kamose stele, discovered at Karnak and providing us with what appears to be a genuinely contemporary, first-person royal account of this pharaoh's military activities against Hyksos authority, offering considerably more direct and detailed information regarding the actual conduct of this conflict than we possess regarding the preceding reign of Seqenenre, whose military activities must be reconstructed primarily through the indirect evidence of his mummy's battle wounds rather than through any comparable surviving textual account of his specific campaigns and strategic decisions. The Kamose inscriptions describe a pharaoh genuinely frustrated with what he characterizes as the ongoing indignity of divided Egyptian sovereignty, presenting a dramatic account of Kamose calling together his senior advisors and military commanders to propose a decisive military campaign against Hyksos authority, and describing significant resistance and hesitation among these advisors, who apparently counseled a more cautious approach, emphasizing the various practical benefits Thebes continued to derive from its existing arrangement with Hyksos authority, including continued access to trade goods and the general stability of not provoking open conflict with a still powerful northern rival. These advisors, according to the inscription's own account, pointed specifically to the practical benefits Thebes enjoyed, including access to delta pastureland for cattle grazing, uninterrupted trade relationships that brought valuable goods into Theban territory, and the simple fact that the existing arrangement, however humiliating from an ideological perspective, at least provided a degree of predictable stability that open warfare would necessarily disrupt. Kamose's own account presents himself as rejecting this cautious counsel, framing his decision to pursue active military campaign as a matter of fundamental principle regarding proper Egyptian sovereignty and religious propriety, explicitly articulating his frustration at ruling as what he characterizes as merely one local chief among several, Forced to share authority over Egyptian territory with both the Hyksos ruler in the north and, as we will discuss further, a significant Nubian power to the south, rather than exercising the kind of unified, comprehensive pharaonic authority over the entirety of Egyptian territory that traditional Egyptian political ideology understood as the proper and natural order of things. The inscription presents Kamose asking his advisors, in language that has been preserved with genuine rhetorical power across the intervening millennia, what exactly it was that gave him pleasure in his current position, questioning why he should continue to accept a situation in which one chief sat in avarice and another in Kush, while he himself sat allied with an Asiatic and a Nubian, each man in possession of his slice of this Egypt, dividing up the land with him. The inscriptions describe Kamose subsequently launching a significant military campaign northward against Hyksos territory, achieving what the text presents as substantial military success, including the capture of various northern Egyptian settlements and the interception of Hyksos communications, most notably including the capture of a diplomatic message that the Hyksos ruler had apparently dispatched to the Nubian kingdom to the south, proposing a coordinated military alliance against the common Theban enemy positioned between these two potential allies. According to Kamose's own account, this intercepted message was captured from a messenger traveling along one of the desert oasis routes that provided an alternative to the main Nile corridor, a route the messenger had apparently chosen specifically to avoid Theban-controlled territory along the river itself, a detail that reveals the genuinely sophisticated geographic and strategic awareness that both sides brought to this conflict, understanding the various possible routes of communication and travel available across the broader Egyptian and Nubian landscape. This intercepted diplomatic correspondence, whatever its precise historical accuracy in every specific detail, illuminates something genuinely important about the broader strategic situation facing Kamose and his eventual successors. The Theban kingdom found itself in a genuinely precarious strategic position, potentially facing coordinated hostility from both the Hyksos to the north and Nubian forces to the south simultaneously, a strategic vulnerability that helps explain both the genuine urgency and the genuine difficulty of the eventual Egyptian War of Liberation, and that provides important context for understanding why this conflict would ultimately require sustained effort across multiple successive reigns rather than being resolved through any single decisive military campaign. The Kamose inscriptions also provide us with genuinely vivid descriptive detail regarding the specific military campaign this pharaoh conducted, describing his forces sailing northward along the Nile, described in the text with evident satisfaction as moving in good spirit, celebrating as they went, and describing specific engagements including the capture of Hyksos vessels on the river itself and raids against specific settlements loyal to Hyksos authority. The text describes Kamose personally inspecting captured Hyksos ships and their cargo, finding them loaded with valuable goods including bronze, lapis lazuli, silver, and various other precious materials, providing us with genuinely valuable incidental evidence regarding the kind of trade goods that moved through Hyksos-controlled territory during this period, and regarding the specific wealth that Kamose's military campaign was evidently capturing as it proceeded northward. Kamose's own reign, despite these apparently significant military achievements, appears to have been relatively brief, and the specific circumstances of his death and succession remain somewhat unclear from the available historical evidence. What is clear is that the ultimate completion of the War of Liberation and the achievement of genuine Egyptian reunification would fall not to Kamose himself, but to his successor Ahmose, whose reign would witness the final, decisive military campaigns that would finally expel Hyksos authority from Egyptian territory entirely and would establish Ahmose as the founding pharaoh of Egypt's 18th dynasty, the same dynasty that would eventually produce Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, and the broader New Kingdom period whose later military conflicts we have examined extensively throughout our previous explorations of Egyptian history. Ahmose and the Siege of Avaris. Let's now turn to Ahmose, whose reign represents the genuine culmination of this multi-generational Egyptian war of liberation, and whose military campaigns against the Hyksos capital of Avaris itself represent the decisive turning point that would finally bring an end to Hyksos' political authority over Egyptian territory. Ahmose came to the Theban throne as a genuinely young ruler, likely still a child or a very young adult, following Kamos's relatively brief reign, meaning that the initial years of his formal kingship would have involved considerable regency and guidance from senior advisors and family members, quite possibly including his own mother, Queen Ahotep, whose own historical significance during this period deserves particular attention, since surviving evidence suggests she played a genuinely significant role in maintaining stability and continuity within the Theban royal government during this crucial transitional period, potentially including some degree of direct involvement in military affairs and administration during the period when her young son was not yet of sufficient age to exercise full independent authority. Our primary source for understanding Ahmose's eventual military campaigns against Avaris comes from the autobiography of a military officer named Ahmose, son of Abana, whose tomb inscription at El Kab, a site south of Thebes along the Nile, provides us with a genuinely remarkable first-person account of military service during this pivotal period, offering the kind of ground-level, participant perspective on these events that is considerably rarer in the surviving ancient Egyptian historical record than the royal, pharaoh-centered inscriptions we have relied upon for understanding conflicts like Kadesh and the Sea People's invasion in our previous explorations. This soldier's autobiography describes his own military career beginning under Seqenenre Tao himself, when he inherited his position as a soldier from his father, continuing through the reign of Kamose, and culminating in extensive service under Ahmose during the final, decisive campaigns against Avaris, providing us with a genuinely unique multi-generational perspective on this extended conflict from the viewpoint of an ordinary participant rather than simply the royal figures whose own inscriptions naturally emphasize their personal heroism and achievement in ways that require the kind of critical historical evaluation we discussed extensively regarding Ramesses II's own account of Kadesh. According to this soldier's account, Ahmose's campaign against Avaris involved an extended siege of the Hyksos capital, a genuinely significant military undertaking given that Avaris, based on subsequent archaeological excavation at the site, appears to have been a substantially fortified and substantially developed urban center, incorporating defensive structures and, based on archaeological evidence, including the remains of what appear to have been dedicated harbor facilities, likely representing a significant center of maritime trade and activity connecting Egypt to the broader Eastern Mediterranean trading networks of this period. The soldier's account describes the siege proceeding through multiple distinct phases, with Egyptian forces apparently needing to overcome the city's water-based defenses before achieving their ultimate objective of capturing the settlement itself, since Avaris's position within the marshy, waterlogged terrain of the eastern delta meant that naval and amphibious operations played a considerably more significant role in this siege than in many other ancient military engagements fought primarily on dry, open terrain. The soldier's autobiography describes his own participation in naval operations during this siege, including specific incidents of close combat and the capture of enemy prisoners, for which he received what he describes as specific royal recognition and reward, including the presentation of what Egyptian military tradition of this period apparently recognized as a formal decoration for battlefield valor, sometimes referred to by modern Egyptologists as the Gold of Valor, a specific type of decorative gold object presented to soldiers who had distinguished themselves through documented battlefield achievement, representing what appears to have been a genuinely systematic and formalized system of military reward and recognition operating within the Egyptian armed forces of this period, considerably predating the more famous systems of military decoration and recognition we associate with later historical periods and later civilizations. The text specifically describes this soldier receiving gold for valor on multiple separate occasions throughout the campaign, along with the presentation of captured prisoners as a form of reward, prisoners who, according to the specific conventions of this period, would have then become the personal property and personal servants of the soldier who had captured them, a practice that provided ordinary soldiers with a genuinely tangible economic incentive for distinguished battlefield service. Beyond simply the formal decorations and royal recognition the text also describes the eventual fall of avarice, achieved after what the available evidence suggests was a genuinely extended siege requiring sustained military effort and significant resources, marked the effective end of independent Hyksos political authority within Egyptian territory, though Ahmos' military campaigns did not conclude with this achievement alone. The soldier's autobiography and other surviving evidence indicate that Ahmos subsequently pursued remaining Hyksos forces and their allies into the southern Levantine region itself, pursuing a siege of the fortified town of Sharuhin in southern Canaan, apparently intended to ensure that defeated Hyksos forces could not simply regroup in this neighboring territory and eventually mount a renewed challenge to restored Egyptian authority. This siege of Sharuhin, according to the soldier's own account, proved to be an even more extended undertaking than the preceding siege of Avaris itself, with the text specifically noting that this particular siege required approximately 3 years to bring to a successful conclusion, a detail that reveals the genuine scale and genuine difficulty of the broader military campaign Ahmos conducted, extending well beyond Egypt's own traditional borders and requiring sustained logistical and military commitment across an extended multi-year time frame. The Southern Front and the Kingdom of Kush. While Ahmos' northern campaigns against the Hyksos represent the most extensively documented and most historically celebrated aspect of this broader Egyptian war of reunification, we must not neglect the equally significant, if less thoroughly documented, southern front of this conflict, involving Egypt's complex and often hostile relationship with the Nubian kingdom of Kush during this same turbulent period. As we touched upon briefly in our discussion of the Kamos inscriptions and the intercepted diplomatic correspondence proposing coordinated Hyksos-Nubian action against Thebes, the Theban kingdom during this period of Egyptian division faced genuine strategic vulnerability not merely from Hyksos authority to the north, but from an independently powerful Nubian kingdom to the south, centered during this period around the significant urban center of Kerma, located considerably further south along the Nile than the territory that even the most powerful earlier Middle Kingdom pharaohs had directly controlled. This Kerma-based Nubian kingdom had, during the period of Egyptian weakness and division that we have been examining throughout tonight's story, developed into a genuinely significant regional power in its own right, incorporating substantial territory along the Nile south of traditional Egyptian borders, and apparently controlling or at least significantly influencing some of the same southern Egyptian territories that Theban authority might otherwise have expected to control, given the traditional historical pattern of Egyptian political and economic dominance over Lower Nubia during earlier, stronger periods of centralized Egyptian rule. Archaeological excavation at Kerma itself has revealed a genuinely sophisticated urban center, incorporating monumental religious architecture, elaborate royal burial practices including the construction of massive tumulus-style royal tombs, and evidence of extensive trade connections extending both northward into Egyptian territory and southward and westward into the broader African interior, painting a picture of a genuinely significant, independently developed civilization rather than a simple peripheral outpost of Egyptian cultural and political influence. The relationship between this Kerma kingdom and the various Egyptian polities to its north, both during the preceding Middle Kingdom period and during the specific period of division we are examining tonight, appears to have been genuinely complex, involving periods of trade and cultural exchange alongside periods of military conflict and territorial competition, particularly regarding control of the specific stretch of Nile territory in Lower Nubia that had traditionally been contested between Egyptian and Nubian political interests. The abandonment or reduced garrisoning of several of the Middle Kingdom fortresses we discussed earlier appears to have occurred during this general period of Egyptian weakness and division, creating an opportunity for Kerma's expanding influence to extend into territory that earlier, stronger Egyptian administrations had more directly controlled. The soldier Ahmose, son of Ibana's autobiography, our valuable window into military service during this period, indicates that this same soldier who had participated so extensively in the northern campaigns against Avaris subsequently also participated in military campaigns against Nubian forces under continued royal service to Ahmose following the successful conclusion of the Northern War against the Hyksos, indicating that the broader project of Egyptian reunification and restoration of comprehensive pharaonic authority required not merely defeating Hyksos power in the north, but also reasserting effective Egyptian control over southern territories that had similarly slipped from direct Egyptian authority during the preceding period of division and weakness. The text describes the soldiers' participation in what appears to have been a significant naval campaign southward along the Nile, involving direct combat with Nubian forces and, according to the soldier's own account, further recognition and reward for his continued distinguished service during these southern campaigns. This southern campaign against Nubian forces, while considerably less extensively documented in surviving sources than the more celebrated Northern War against the Hyksos, represents a genuinely important and often underappreciated dimension of this broader period of Egyptian military and political reconstruction, illustrating that the achievement of genuine, comprehensive Egyptian reunification required sustained military effort on multiple simultaneous fronts, against multiple distinct adversaries, rather than representing simply a straightforward single-front conflict against a single clearly defined enemy of the kind that later conflicts like Kadesh would more clearly represent. The soldier's autobiography additionally mentions his participation in suppressing what appears to have been some form of internal rebellion or uprising occurring within Egyptian territory itself during this general period, a detail that, while frustratingly brief and lacking in specific detail regarding the exact nature and location of this internal disturbance, nonetheless reminds us that the broader process of Egyptian reunification likely involved not merely external military campaigns against Hyksos and Nubian forces, but also the genuine internal challenge of securing loyalty and suppressing potential resistance or rebellion within the newly reunified Egyptian territory itself, as local administrators and local populations who had, in some cases, spent their entire lives under Hyksos rather than Theban political authority, adjusted to the genuinely significant transition of returning to unified native Egyptian governance. The eventual success of these southern campaigns, combined with the successful conclusion of the Northern War against Hyksos authority, allowed Ahmose to establish himself as the genuine, unchallenged pharaoh over a fully reunified Egyptian kingdom, restoring for the first time in over a century the kind of comprehensive, centralized pharaonic authority over both northern and southern Egyptian territory that had characterized the strongest periods of earlier Egyptian history, and establishing the foundation upon which the subsequent New Kingdom period, with its own remarkable military and cultural achievements that we have examined extensively in our previous explorations of Egyptian history, would eventually be built. Rebuilding a shattered kingdom. Let's spend some time now considering the genuinely enormous administrative and practical challenge that Ahmose faced following his military victories, because achieving battlefield success against both Hyksos and Nubian forces represented only the first stage of what would prove to be a genuinely extensive and genuinely difficult process of rebuilding effective, unified Egyptian governance following more than a century of political division and, in various regions, considerable disruption to traditional administrative and economic structures. The practical challenge of reunifying territories that had, for multiple generations, existed under entirely separate political administrations, with separate tax systems, separate local administrative hierarchies, and, particularly in the case of the former Hyksos territories, populations that had lived for generations under foreign rather than native Egyptian political authority, required considerably more than simple military victory to fully resolve. Ahmose and his immediate successors faced the genuine administrative challenge of reestablishing effective, unified Egyptian governance across this entire reunified territory, incorporating former Hyksos administrative personnel and local officials where practical and where their continued service could be secured, while simultaneously working to reestablish the kind of comprehensive, centrally directed administrative and religious institutions that had characterized the strongest periods of earlier unified Egyptian rule. This process would have involved practical decisions at every level of Egyptian society. Local scribes and administrators throughout the formerly Hyksos-controlled territories, individuals who had spent their entire careers, in many cases, serving Hyksos rather than native Egyptian authority, needed to be either incorporated into the restored native administration or replaced with personnel whose loyalty to the new Theban-based government could be more confidently assumed. The specific tax and tribute systems that had operated separately within Hyksos and Theban territory needed to be reconciled and unified into a single, coherent system of royal revenue collection extending across the entirety of the reunified kingdom. Local religious institutions throughout the former Hyksos territory, including temples that may have continued traditional Egyptian religious practice throughout the preceding period, but that had operated under ultimate Hyksos rather than native Egyptian royal patronage and oversight, needed to be brought back within the framework of the restored native Egyptian religious and administrative hierarchy. This process of administrative reconstruction appears to have included significant efforts to reestablish and reinvigorate traditional Egyptian religious institutions throughout the reunified kingdom, including particularly the temple establishments and religious personnel connected to the god Ammonius at Thebes, whose continued prominence and continued royal patronage throughout the subsequent New Kingdom period reflects, at least in part, the specific historical circumstance of Thebes having served as the base of operations for this successful war of liberation and reunification, elevating this southern city's religious and political significance considerably beyond what its position might otherwise have warranted based purely on its geographic and economic characteristics relative to other Egyptian population centers, particularly those located in the more agriculturally productive and more centrally positioned regions of the Nile Delta and Memphis area. The broader trauma of the preceding period of division and foreign rule appears to have left a genuinely lasting impression on Egyptian political and strategic thinking, an impression that would significantly influence the subsequent strategic priorities and military policies of the New Kingdom pharaohs who succeeded Ahmose, including specifically the pattern of sustained Egyptian military engagement throughout the Levantine region that we examined extensively in our previous exploration of the Strategic context surrounding the Battle of Kadesh. The specific historical experience of having suffered foreign conquest and prolonged foreign occupation of core Egyptian territory, achieved partly through the ability of foreign populations to establish themselves within Egypt and eventually translate this demographic and economic presence into genuine political authority, appears to have instilled in subsequent Egyptian rulers a persistent strategic concern with preventing any comparable buildup of potentially hostile foreign power along Egypt's frontiers, a concern that helps explain the sustained, centuries-long pattern of Egyptian military intervention and political influence throughout the Levantine buffer region that we have examined in previous explorations of Egyptian military history, extending all the way through the reigns of Seti I, Ramesses II, and Ramesses III. This connection between the trauma of the Hyksos period and the subsequent strategic priorities of New Kingdom Egyptian foreign policy represents one of the most genuinely important, if often underappreciated, historical legacies of the internal Egyptian conflict we have been examining throughout tonight's story, illustrating how a genuinely internal, domestic political and military crisis could produce strategic lessons and strategic priorities that would continue to shape Egyptian foreign and military policy for many subsequent generations, long after the specific circumstances of Hyksos rule and the war of liberation against it had passed into historical memory. The specific military innovations and specific military technologies that Egypt encountered and eventually adopted from its Hyksos adversaries during this conflict, including notably the horse-drawn chariot and the composite bow technology that would become such central features of the New Kingdom military system we examined extensively regarding Kadesh, represent another genuinely significant, if somewhat ironic, legacy of this period, since the very Hyksos presence that native Egyptian ideology understood as such a profound humiliation appears to have also served as the specific historical channel through which these crucial military technologies, originally developed elsewhere in the wider Near Eastern world, first entered into Egyptian military practice, technologies that Egyptian forces would subsequently master and deploy with such devastating effectiveness during the New Kingdom period's own extensive military campaigns throughout the Levantine region. The legend of Queen Ahotep. Let's return now to a figure we mentioned briefly earlier in tonight's story, but who deserves considerably more detailed attention. Queen Ahotep, mother of Ahmose, whose role during this critical period of Egyptian history has attracted considerable scholarly interest and, in more recent decades, considerable popular attention as well, reflecting a broader historical pattern we have observed in some of our previous explorations of women's roles in ancient warfare and governance. The specific evidence regarding Ahotep's precise role during the culmination of the war against the Hyksos comes primarily from a stela erected by her son Ahmose himself, an inscription that describes his mother in genuinely striking terms, characterizing her as one who has accomplished the rites and taken care of Egypt, who has looked after her soldiers, guarded her, brought back her fugitives, and gathered together her deserters, language that, whatever its precise literal interpretation, strongly suggests that Ahotep played a genuinely active and genuinely significant role in maintaining military and administrative stability during what must have been a particularly vulnerable period for the Theban kingdom, likely during the transition following Kamo's death and during the early years of Ahmose's own reign when he was still too young to exercise fully independent royal authority. This textual evidence regarding Ahotep's significant role finds intriguing potential archaeological support in the discovery of her own burial equipment, excavated in the 19th century near Thebes, which included, remarkably, military decorations of the same type awarded for battlefield valor that we discussed regarding the soldier Ahmose, son of Abana's own military service, including specific gold fly-shaped pendants that Egyptian military tradition of this period appears to have. Specifically associated with recognition of persistent, courageous military service, decorations that would represent a genuinely unusual inclusion within a royal woman's burial equipment if she had not, in some capacity, been personally connected to and personally recognized for some form of military-related achievement or service during this turbulent period. Her burial equipment additionally included a genuinely remarkable ceremonial axe, its blade decorated with imagery including a griffin trampling an enemy and a specific decorative scene showing what appears to be Ahmose himself, along with other weapons and military-associated objects that, taken together, present a genuinely striking picture of a royal woman whose burial goods reflect martial themes and martial recognition considerably more extensively than would typically be expected for a queen whose role had been confined purely to conventional domestic and ceremonial functions. Modern historians approach the specific question of Ahotep's exact role with appropriate scholarly caution, recognizing that the available evidence, while genuinely suggestive of significant activity and significant royal recognition, does not allow for entirely definitive reconstruction of precisely what specific actions and specific responsibilities this remarkable woman actually undertook during this critical period. Some scholars have suggested she may have played a direct role in suppressing some form of internal rebellion or unrest during the vulnerable transitional period following Kamose's death, potentially explaining the specific language regarding gathering deserters and bringing back fugitives found in her son's commemorative inscription, language that might describe either a literal military campaign she personally directed against rebellious or deserting soldiers, or a somewhat more metaphorical description of her broader efforts to maintain stability, order, and continued loyalty to the royal government during a period of genuine political vulnerability and uncertainty. Others emphasize a somewhat more general, if still genuinely significant, interpretation of her role as involving crucial administrative and morale-related leadership during a period when the young Ahmose required exactly this kind of experienced, capable guidance and support to successfully navigate the ongoing military and political challenges his kingdom continued to face. Under this interpretation, Ahotep's genuine achievement lay less in any direct personal participation in military combat and more in her successful management of the broader administrative and political apparatus of the Theban kingdom during a period when its young, newly installed pharaoh required exactly this kind of experienced regency and guidance, a role that, while perhaps less dramatically compelling than direct battlefield leadership, would nonetheless have represented a genuinely essential contribution to the eventual success of the broader war effort that her son would ultimately bring to its successful conclusion. Whatever the precise specific details of her actual activities, Ahotep's case provides us with a genuinely valuable additional dimension to our broader understanding of this critical period of Egyptian history, reminding us that the eventual successful reunification of Egypt, ultimately credited primarily to the male pharaohs Seqenenre, Kamose, and Ahmose, whose military campaigns we have examined in considerable detail throughout tonight's story, also depended significantly on the less directly documented but nonetheless apparently genuinely crucial contributions of royal women who provided essential continuity, essential administrative capability, and, according to at least some interpretation of the available evidence, quite possibly direct military or quasi-military leadership during the most vulnerable and most uncertain phases of this extended, multi-generational conflict. This pattern of significant, if often incompletely documented, female contribution to major Egyptian military and political achievements represents a theme we have encountered, in various forms, throughout several of our previous explorations of ancient history, and Ahotep's case stands as one of the more genuinely striking examples of this broader historical pattern from within the specific context of ancient Egyptian civilization itself. Archaeological evidence from Avaris. Let's turn our attention now to the specific archaeological evidence that has emerged from modern excavations at the site of ancient Avaris itself. Evidence that has significantly enriched and, in several important respects, complicated our understanding of the Hyksos period and the eventual Egyptian war of liberation against Hyksos authority that we have been examining throughout tonight's story. Modern archaeological excavation at the site now known as Tel El Daba, identified as the location of ancient Avaris, has been conducted extensively over recent decades, led significantly by Austrian archaeological teams whose sustained, methodical excavation work has gradually revealed a genuinely sophisticated and genuinely substantial urban settlement that flourished during the period of Hyksos rule, incorporating architectural styles, burial practices, and material culture that reveal genuine connections to the broader Western Asiatic and Levantine cultural world from which the Hyksos population appears to have originally derived, while also incorporating substantial elements of adopted or adapted Egyptian architectural and administrative traditions, consistent with the broader pattern of cultural accommodation and adaptation we have discussed regarding Hyksos governance more generally. This archaeological evidence has revealed the presence of distinctively Western Asiatic-style domestic architecture within the settlement, including specific house layouts and specific construction techniques that show genuine parallels with contemporary settlements in the Levantine region, rather than following traditional Egyptian domestic architectural conventions, along with burial practices, including specific types of grave goods and specific burial orientations that differ meaningfully from traditional Egyptian burial customs, while showing genuine connections to broader Levantine and Western Asiatic burial traditions of this general period, including notably the practice of burying donkeys alongside human graves, a specific ritual practice with clear parallels in contemporary Levantine burial traditions, but with no comparable precedent within traditional native Egyptian mortuary practice, providing genuinely valuable independent archaeological confirmation of the broader historical narrative regarding Hyksos origins and Hyksos cultural identity that we have primarily reconstructed thus far from later Egyptian textual sources. Sources that, as we discussed regarding other periods of Egyptian history throughout our previous explorations, require appropriate critical evaluation given their production by the eventually victorious Theban dynasty with obvious interest in presenting their Hyksos adversaries in a particular light. Perhaps most strikingly, archaeological excavation at Avaris has revealed evidence of what appears to have been a genuinely significant and genuinely sophisticated harbor and maritime trading facility, connecting this delta capital to broader Eastern Mediterranean trading networks extending as far as Cyprus and the broader Aegean world, evidence that includes the discovery of imported pottery styles and other material culture with clear origins in these more distant Mediterranean regions, helping explain the genuine economic significance and genuine strategic importance that this Hyksos capital appears to have possessed during the period of its greatest prominence, and that helps contextualize why its eventual capture by Ahmose forces represented such a genuinely significant military and political achievement, involving not merely the defeat of a regional political rival, but the conquest of what appears to have been one of the most economically significant and most well-developed urban centers within the entire Eastern Mediterranean world of this period. Excavations at the site have additionally revealed evidence of what some archaeologists interpret as significant Minoan cultural influence or connection, including fragments of wall paintings executed in styles that show genuine stylistic parallels with contemporary Minoan fresco painting traditions from Crete, a discovery that, if the proposed interpretation is correct, would suggest that Hyksos-controlled Avaris maintained genuinely significant and genuinely sophisticated cultural and possibly diplomatic connections extending across the Eastern Mediterranean as far as the Minoan civilization of Crete, connections that would place this Hyksos capital within a considerably broader and considerably more cosmopolitan network of Bronze Age Mediterranean cultural and political relationships than a purely Egypt-focused historical narrative might otherwise suggest, though the precise interpretation and precise chronological placement of these particular fresco fragments remains a subject of ongoing scholarly discussion and debate among specialists in this specific area of Bronze Age Mediterranean archaeology. The archaeological evidence from Avaris has also, somewhat controversially among specialists in this particular period of Egyptian history, contributed to ongoing scholarly debate regarding the precise nature and precise sequence of the eventual Egyptian conquest of this site under Ahmose, with some archaeological evidence suggesting a somewhat more complex and potentially more gradual pattern of Egyptian reoccupation and reintegration of this territory than might be suggested by a purely textual reading of the more triumphant, straightforwardly military narrative presented in sources like the soldier Ahmose son of Abana's autobiography, illustrating once again the genuinely valuable but also genuinely complicating role that ongoing archaeological research continues to play in refining and sometimes challenging our understanding of even relatively well-documented periods of ancient Egyptian history. Some specific archaeological layers at the site show evidence of continued occupation and continued use of certain structures following the traditional date assigned to Ahmose's conquest, suggesting that the transition from Hyksos to restored Egyptian control over this specific territory may have involved a more gradual process of administrative transition and population adjustment than a simple, sudden military conquest narrative alone would suggest, a nuance that responsible historians must incorporate into their broader understanding of this period, even while recognizing the genuine, fundamental accuracy of the broader narrative regarding eventual successful Egyptian reunification under Ahmose's leadership. Comparing this civil war to later Egyptian conflicts, let's take some time now to reflect on how this internal Egyptian conflict, culminating in the eventual reunification achieved under Ahmose, compares to and relates with the other significant Egyptian military conflicts we have examined in our previous explorations, because this comparative perspective helps illuminate both the genuinely distinctive character of this particular episode and its genuine significance within the broader sweep of ancient Egyptian military and political history. Unlike the Battle of Kadesh, which we examined in detail as a conflict between two comparably matched, externally distinct great powers, Egypt and the Hittite Empire, each fielding sophisticated professional military forces including thousands of chariots in the kind of large-scale, set-piece confrontation that characterized the height of Bronze Age imperial warfare, the war against the Hyksos represents a genuinely different kind of military conflict, involving extended siege warfare, the gradual, multi-generational reconquest of lost territory, and the genuinely complex challenge of not merely defeating an external enemy in open battle, but of dismantling an entrenched foreign political and administrative presence that had, over the course of more than a century, become genuinely established within traditionally Egyptian territory. Where Kadesh represented a single, massive engagement concentrated within a single day of dramatic, chaotic combat, the Hyksos War represents a genuinely extended, multi-decade campaign involving several distinct sieges, naval engagements, and sustained military and administrative effort extending across 3 successive royal reigns. Similarly, unlike the Battle of the Delta against the Sea Peoples that we examined regarding Ramesses III's reign, which involved Egypt successfully defending itself against an external invasion force during a period of broader regional civilizational collapse, the Hyksos conflict represents Egypt in the opposite strategic position, as the party seeking to reverse a previous experience of successful foreign conquest and to reclaim previously lost territory and previously lost political Sovereignty, a strategic situation with genuinely different tactical and strategic requirements than either the defensive naval battle at the Delta or the more conventional territorial dispute that characterized the Kadesh conflict, where Ramesses III fought primarily a defensive campaign, using Egyptian home terrain and Egyptian defensive preparation to repel an external threat. Ahmose and his predecessors fought primarily an offensive campaign of reconquest, requiring them to project military force into territory that had, for generations, existed under a genuinely different political administration. And in comparison to the later Assyrian and Persian conquests of Egypt that we examined in our most recent exploration of Egyptian military history, conflicts in which Egypt found itself on the receiving end of conquest by external imperial powers considerably more militarily and technologically sophisticated than Egyptian forces of those particular later periods could effectively counter. The Hyksos conflict represents an intriguing historical precedent in which Egypt, having suffered a genuinely comparable experience of foreign conquest and foreign political domination, ultimately proved capable of successfully reversing the situation through sustained military effort and successful reunification under capable native leadership, a genuinely different historical outcome than the pattern of persistent, repeated, and ultimately more permanent foreign domination that would characterize Egypt's later historical experience under Assyrian, Persian, and eventually Greek and Roman rule. This distinction matters genuinely. The Egypt that emerged from the Hyksos War under Ahmose leadership went on to enjoy several centuries of renewed native sovereignty and renewed imperial expansion, while the Egypt that emerged from the later Persian conquest, despite periodic interruptions of renewed native rule, would ultimately never again achieve fully independent native pharaonic government following the eventual conquests by Alexander the Great and subsequent Ptolemaic and later Roman rule. This comparative perspective helps illuminate why the successful war of liberation against the Hyksos held such genuinely enduring significance within Egyptian historical memory and Egyptian political ideology throughout the subsequent New Kingdom period, representing a genuinely important precedent and genuinely important source of ideological and religious legitimacy for the New Kingdom pharaohs who traced their own dynastic legitimacy directly back to Ahmose's own successful achievement of Egyptian reunification and restored native sovereignty, a legitimacy that would continue to inform and to justify the sustained pattern of aggressive New Kingdom military expansion and sustained military engagement throughout the broader Levantine region that characterized so much of subsequent Egyptian foreign and military policy throughout the reigns of pharaohs including Thutmose III, Seti I, and Ramesses II himself, whose own dramatic near-disaster and eventual strategic stalemate at Kadesh we examined in such detail in our very first exploration of ancient Egyptian military history. The founding of the New Kingdom. Let's spend some time now considering the genuinely significant longer-term historical consequences of Ahmose's successful reunification of Egypt, because this achievement did not simply end one particular internal conflict, but rather established the essential political, administrative, and ideological foundation upon which the entire subsequent New Kingdom period, arguably the most militarily and culturally significant era in the entire span of ancient Egyptian history, would eventually be constructed. Ahmose's establishment of Egypt's 18th dynasty, achieved through the successful military campaigns and successful administrative reconstruction efforts we have examined throughout tonight's story, inaugurated what modern historians recognize as the beginning of the New Kingdom period, an era that would eventually produce not merely the military conflicts we have examined in our previous explorations, but also some of the most celebrated cultural, architectural, and religious achievements in the entire history of ancient Egyptian civilization, including the reign of the female pharaoh Hatshepsut, whose own remarkable and historically significant reign followed within just a few generations of Ahmose' own achievements, and the reign of Thutmose III, whose extensive military campaigns throughout the Levantine region, including the historically significant Battle of Megiddo, would establish Egyptian imperial authority over a considerably larger territorial extent than Egypt had ever previously controlled, building directly upon the restored national unity and restored military capability that Ahmose's successful War of Liberation had first established. Ahmose's own subsequent reign, following his successful military campaigns, appears to have included significant efforts toward broader reconstruction and consolidation, including renewed royal building projects at various temple sites throughout the reunified kingdom, and what appears to have been a genuine, deliberate effort to re-establish the kind of comprehensive royal patronage of Egyptian religious institutions that had characterized the strongest periods of earlier centralized Egyptian rule. This period of post-war reconstruction, while considerably less dramatically documented than the military campaigns themselves, represents an equally essential component of the broader historical achievement we have been examining throughout tonight's story, since sustainable, lasting reunification required not merely military victory but the genuine, patient work of rebuilding institutional capacity and institutional legitimacy across the entirety of the newly reunified kingdom. The specific administrative and religious institutions that Ahmose and his immediate successors worked to reestablish and reinvigorate following the successful conclusion of the war against Hyksos authority, including particularly the elevated religious and political significance accorded to Thebes and to the cult of the god Ammonius, would continue to shape Egyptian political and religious life throughout the entire subsequent New Kingdom period, ultimately including the very temple complexes at Karnak and Luxor, whose eventual sack by Assyrian forces under Ashurbanipal we examined with such attention in our previous exploration of the later Assyrian and Persian conquests of Egypt, illustrating a genuinely striking historical circularity. The same city and the same religious institutions that Ahmose's successful War of Liberation had helped elevate to their position of preeminent religious and political significance would, several centuries later, become the specific target of a devastating foreign conquest that would itself be remembered as one of the most significant traumas in the entire subsequent history of ancient Egyptian civilization. This historical arc, from the trauma of Hyksos domination through the successful War of Liberation under Seqenenre, Kamose, and Ahmose, through the subsequent centuries of New Kingdom imperial expansion and achievement, and eventually to the later traumas of Assyrian and Persian conquest that we examined in our most recent exploration, illustrates something genuinely important about the broader, longer-term pattern of ancient Egyptian history, a civilization that experienced genuine cycles of weakness, foreign domination, successful native restoration, and renewed strength, followed eventually by renewed periods of weakness and renewed foreign domination, a pattern of historical resilience and historical vulnerability that, as we discussed extensively in our previous exploration, reflects both the genuine underlying strength and durability of core Egyptian religious, cultural, and administrative institutions, and the genuine, persistent vulnerability that even these deeply rooted institutions faced when confronted with sufficiently powerful and sufficiently well-organized external threats during particular periods of Egyptian political weakness or fragmentation. What the sources don't tell us. Let's take some time now to honestly acknowledge the genuine limitations and genuine uncertainties that characterize our historical knowledge of this particular period of ancient Egyptian history, because responsible historical understanding requires acknowledging not merely what we know, but also the genuine boundaries and genuine limitations of that knowledge. The surviving textual evidence for the war against the Hyksos, while including the genuinely valuable Kamos stele and the remarkable soldier's autobiography of Amos son of Abana that we have discussed extensively throughout tonight's story, remains considerably more limited and considerably more fragmentary than the surviving documentary evidence we possess regarding later, better documented periods of Egyptian history, including particularly the extensive royal inscriptions and accompanying visual depictions that we examined regarding both the Battle of Kadesh and the Sea People's conflict under Ramesses III. This relative scarcity of surviving primary source material means that our reconstruction of many specific details regarding this earlier conflict, including precise chronologies, precise casualty figures, and the precise sequence of specific military engagements, necessarily involves a somewhat greater degree of scholarly inference and scholarly reconstruction than has been the case regarding some of the later, more extensively documented conflicts we have examined in previous explorations of Egyptian military history. We do not, for instance, possess anything comparable to the extensive, if admittedly propagandistically inflected, royal battle narratives that Ramesses II commissioned regarding Kadesh, or that Ramesses III commissioned regarding his own victory over the Sea Peoples. Our understanding of the specific military campaigns conducted by Seqenenre, Kamos, and Amos relies instead on a combination of the more limited royal inscriptions that do survive, the invaluable but inherently limited perspective offered by a single soldier's personal autobiography, and the kind of careful archaeological analysis, including the remarkable forensic examination of Seqenenre's own preserved mummy, that has allowed modern scholars to reconstruct at least some specific details regarding the actual conduct and actual violence of this conflict. This relative scarcity of evidence means that responsible historians must remain genuinely cautious regarding several specific aspects of the traditional historical narrative we have presented throughout tonight's story, including the precise chronological sequence and precise duration of the various military campaigns we have discussed, the precise circumstances surrounding Seqenenre's death, which, despite the remarkable forensic evidence available regarding his physical wounds, still leaves genuine uncertainty regarding the broader circumstances, including whether his death occurred during active combat, during a specific isolated military engagement, or under some other set of circumstances that the physical evidence alone cannot definitively establish, and the precise nature and precise extent of Queen Ahotep's genuinely significant but still somewhat ambiguously documented role during this critical period. Additional uncertainty surrounds the precise chronological length of the overall conflict, with different scholarly reconstructions proposing timeframes ranging from a few decades to potentially somewhat longer periods depending on specific interpretations of the available regnal year evidence for Seqenenre, Kamos, and the early years of Amos' own reign. Similarly, the precise population dynamics and precise demographic composition of the Hyksos-controlled territory remain subjects of ongoing scholarly research and occasional revision, as new archaeological discoveries, including continued excavation at Avars itself, periodically add new evidence that can refine or, in some cases, meaningfully challenge previous scholarly reconstructions of this period. Acknowledging these genuine uncertainties does not diminish the genuine historical significance of the broader narrative we have presented throughout tonight's story, a narrative that finds genuine support across multiple independent lines of evidence, including textual, archaeological, and forensic sources, even as it appropriately reminds us that our knowledge of even historically significant and historically consequential episodes from the ancient past necessarily remains, in many important respects, a matter of ongoing scholarly reconstruction and ongoing scholarly debate, rather than representing a simple, straightforward, and entirely settled body of established historical fact, a reminder that applies in varying degrees to virtually every episode of ancient history we have examined throughout our various explorations of Egyptian military history. What the War of Liberation left behind. As we bring tonight's story to its close, let's reflect on the genuine, lasting historical significance of this remarkable episode of internal Egyptian conflict and eventual national restoration. An episode that, despite receiving considerably less popular historical attention than more famous conflicts like Kadesh or the various later conquests of Egypt that we have examined in previous explorations, arguably represents one of the most genuinely foundational and most genuinely consequential episodes in the entire span of ancient Egyptian history. The successful War of Liberation against Hyksos domination, achieved through the sustained, multi-generational military effort of Seqenenre Tao, Kamos, and ultimately Amos, working alongside the less directly documented but apparently genuinely significant contributions of figures including Queen Ahotep, did not merely restore Egyptian political independence and Egyptian territorial unity following more than a century of division and, in significant portions of the country, direct foreign rule. It established the essential political, ideological, and religious foundation upon which the entire subsequent New Kingdom period, with all of its remarkable military, architectural, and cultural achievements, would eventually be constructed, connecting this relatively obscure and relatively poorly documented internal conflict directly to the later achievements of pharaohs including Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Seti I, and Ramesses II himself, whose own dramatic military career we examined so extensively in our very first exploration of ancient Egyptian military history. The genuinely brutal violence documented in Seqenenre's own preserved mummy reminds us that this foundational episode of Egyptian national restoration was not achieved through purely abstract political maneuvering or purely diplomatic negotiation, but through genuine, sustained, and genuinely costly military conflict serious enough to claim the life of at least one Egyptian pharaoh in circumstances of genuinely disturbing violence, and requiring the sustained commitment of multiple successive generations of the same royal family before finally achieving its ultimate objective of restored Egyptian unity and restored Egyptian sovereignty. The eventual triumph achieved under Amos, whatever the specific uncertainties that continue to characterize our detailed historical understanding of exactly how this triumph was achieved, established a genuinely important historical and ideological template that would continue to inform Egyptian political and religious thought throughout the subsequent centuries of New Kingdom prosperity and achievement, a template emphasizing the fundamental importance of unified, native Egyptian sovereignty, and the genuine religious and cosmic significance that Egyptian ideology attached to the successful maintenance of this unified sovereignty against any potential foreign threat or foreign domination. A template that would continue to shape Egyptian strategic thinking and Egyptian military policy for many subsequent centuries, extending all the way through the reigns of the later New Kingdom pharaohs, whose own military conflicts we have examined in such detail throughout our previous explorations of ancient Egyptian history. The site of ancient Avaris, once the proud capital of Hyksos political authority over northern Egypt, today exists primarily as an archaeological site. Its ancient buildings and ancient harbor facilities, revealed through decades of careful modern excavation, providing ongoing scholarly insight into a period of Egyptian history that remains, in many respects, considerably less thoroughly understood than the later periods whose more extensive textual and archaeological evidence we have been able to draw upon in our previous explorations. And yet the genuine historical significance of what occurred at this site and throughout the broader territory of ancient Egypt during this turbulent, formative period of internal conflict and eventual restoration continues to resonate through the entire subsequent span of Egyptian history, connecting this relatively obscure episode of internal Egyptian civil war directly to the later achievements and later conflicts, both triumphant and tragic, that would continue to define the remarkable, multi-millennial story of ancient Egyptian civilization for many centuries to come. The Nile continues its patient flow past the site of ancient avarice, as it flowed past Seqenenre's final, fatal battle, past Kamos's determined military campaigns, and past Ahmos's ultimate triumph in reuniting a kingdom that had been divided for more than a century. The specific individuals whose sustained courage and sustained sacrifice achieved this remarkable restoration are, for the most part, remembered today only by specialists in this particular period of ancient Egyptian history, their achievements considerably overshadowed in popular historical memory by the later, more extensively documented achievements of their new kingdom successors. But the kingdom they restored, and the foundational template of unified, sovereign, native Egyptian rule that their sustained military and political efforts successfully reestablished, would continue to shape the course of ancient Egyptian history for many centuries to come, representing one of the most genuinely significant, if genuinely underappreciated, turning points in the entire remarkable, multi-millennial story of ancient Egyptian civilization. Sleep well. Good night.